In terms of the approaches, after 9/11, you know that we have been using more what we call um, counter-terrorism actions, meaning militarization of our approach on the continent. Let's go and bomb terrorists wherever they are. Situation. We also saw that on the African continent, we have been using what we call military stabilization approaches. AMISOM, for example, in Somalia. And then we have also put in the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad Basin. You know, I was there with General Irabo, who was the first commander within the Lake Chad Basin to stabilize that region against Boko Haram. But part of the study we had done through UNDP and the ECOWAS and the AU was to understand the root causes. What are the trigger points for why do people end up being radicalized into violent extremism and terrorism? And I read studies on Nigeria in particular on income inequality. How does income inequality provide the basis for people to engage into societies and communities to engage into violent extremism? In other words, in short, on the African continent, we are shifting, there's a paradigm shift from militarization of the fight against violent extremism and terrorism to much more of a development approach, because we have realized that many of the root causes of our youths and young people being attracted to radicalization, to violent extremism and the groups we have seen. As a result of those issues you guys mentioned last week, which is about, do they have jobs? Where are they? Where are these youths? Are they within the border regions? Are they rural youths, rural urban migration, or overseas migration? What is their level of education? Poverty level. They do not even have housing, shelter. Many of the youths today do not have access to better health, better jobs. Unemployment rate, we have just mentioned, 60 to 70% in many African countries. Access to finance for development, which you guys mentioned last week. Do they have collaterals? They don't have collaterals to access loans in banks so that there can be innovation. So what you see is for fragile states and conflict-affected states where we talk about the ungoverned space. You know, most of, like Mali, for example, is governed, share borders with 7 other member states. So do they have, when we focus on the nation state, the state model, is it working? How do we ensure that we move our nation state from public administration to public governance? In other words, what role can civil society play? What role can the media play? What role can rural communities play in terms of addressing some of the structural challenges? We have enabling environments where if you don't provide social and economic opportunities for the youth, then they are easily attracted to some of this group. So part of the policy agenda and strategies and approaches, as you meant, one is about how do we prevent what we call PVE, preventing violent extremism, by addressing some of the social and economic programs. If you go to the Lake Chad Basin now, the UN has, together with the Lake Chad Basin Commission and the African Union, have established what we call Regional Stabilization Facility Trust Fund. And that trust fund provides opportunity for transformation of youth in terms of the border regions, particularly north of Cameroon. And then if you go to northeast Nigeria, and then look at the Bo state in Chad, and the Difa region in Niger, we have programs that targeting what we call disengaging combatants, because disengaging combatants from Boko Haram. How do we treat and handle those who defect, those who will deceptively defect from groups such as Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram? When I was in Somalia, for example, I also helped the UN when I was there as a director to design what we call a national program for disengaging combatants from Al-Shabaab. Many are youth at risk to Al-Shabaab, youth at risk to Boko Haram. That's the model in terms of experience sharing. That's the model lessons we're identifying that we are replicating the Lake Chad Basin in areas recovered from Boko Haram. How do we ensure that? We provide access to school, education. We treat and handle those who defect from Boko Haram in terms of with respect to human rights and international humanitarian law. But we are also providing skills and vocational training from them through that type of program. So there are a number of these programs that sports for development. As we know, the youth in particular, we all went through transformation. I asked myself, yes, my mother was illiterate as I sit here today, but she had access to resources to put me and my brother, a family of 10, into a childhood transformation path. And that is what many of our youth are missing. I remember in your summary, you mentioned the role of social capital, the social protection. How does the family unit itself support youth transformation so that we are all leaders today, we are all doctors, we are all directors in the UN, we provide support to that. But how did we go through that transformation? So there is a gap within that. So there are programs that do with trauma healing, transformation, psychosocial thing, which I imagine there are a number of these programs on the continent, in the Sahel region, in the Lake Chad Basin. Though they are, in terms of origin and evolution, they are emerging. But the whole approach is how do we shift from militarization to addressing some of the structural root causes of why people engage into violent extremism, which essentially has to do with some of the issues you discussed last week, socioeconomic. And therefore, how do we give them the opportunity? And some of the opportunity are established national youth trust funds, like in Sierra Leone, we have in Nigeria and Sierra Leone and many countries, we now have national youth services where people do mentoring, coaching. I also do that. I run that a lot in what I do, which is part of the agenda of how do we fight for their political right. So in a nutshell, we need to focus our effort on preventing violent extremism by addressing the socioeconomic issues that make people to engage into radicalization. When you look at the African Union, there are two things we are grateful for. I just mentioned how the African Union provided the African Union Charter. What is unique about the African Union Charter when compared to the UN Charter? The UN is that in the African Union Charter, member states and all of us as citizens had put into that charter the principle of solidarity, which is very key, which is not in the UN Charter. That's the main difference. The principle of solidarity tends to be moving forward in Africa. I'm very proud that when we had Ebola in my own country, Sierra Leone here, and the Mano River Union Space, Liberia and Guinea in particular, the African Union set up what we call the ASIWA, the African Solidarity Initiative, which had, most of the treatment centers where Ebola patients were, you can't believe, there were Kenyans, you have Nigerians, Kenyans, Rwandese, Ugandans. They are the ones who were side by side with their brothers and sisters in the Mano River in treating them because of their experience in addressing global health crisis. The normative frameworks and the policy framework, we have developed a lot of that at the AU level. But people sometimes ask me, why is the AU not here? Why is the AU not in the 54 member states? I tell people that the AU was designed to provide two things about we should be grateful about the AU. One, AU is the only platform we have in Africa that can mobilize 54 member states. In other words, the AU has the convening power to bring all head of states and member states, ministers, civil society, media, into a common space. That's a beauty. Second, the AU facilitates conversation like we are doing now to develop policies and normative frameworks that could assist us in implementing the spirit of the African Union Constitutive Act, the Common Defense Act, the Youth Charter, and all of those things we are talking about. So when you even look at the African Union Charter on Democracy, Election, and Good Governance, we have all of this. We have our parliament. So, but the question, like you did say, how much can we translate, popularize some of this normative policy framework on the ground so that member states can translate this either in their parliament, in their legal reform and policy reform, so that the gap between policy formulation or available policies and implementation, we can close that. And as we say, all of this is really about how do we increase citizens and the youth in particular, so that we can harness the benefit to come there. Because when you look at Agenda 2063 and the sustainable agenda, the sustainable development goals for 2030, many of us here, like we did say, 2063, I'm not sure, maybe I'll be around, I don't know. But the fact is, how do we start to invest in the youth now so that the policy agenda, the visions and aspirations, which we have all agreed through our head of state, based on Agenda 2063, we can be able to support. And that is where the issue is very clear. We need to fast track. And if we want to fast track the achievement of the principles and objectives and the desired outcome of Agenda 2063, and then linked to the SDG 2030, we need definitely to invest in our youth. And therefore, I agree with you, many of the programs are there, but we have not been able to harness the labor force that we need, which is the youth, to promote some of those things. And this is where I think this conversation that we have started, how do we popularize some of these instruments? How do we ensure that civil society and the youth, in our national development plans, in our national development program, how do we ensure that our national budgetary processes, government take is sensitive to the issues that we are highlighting, especially in terms of engaging the youth in promoting our economic growth and development.
Let me say that after the conversation I had with you last time, I'm not going to make a keynote address. I've had the advantage of listening to the good doctor, with whom I disagree on quite a number of issues, particularly when he talks about the AU that he's talking about is really, if you talk to 10 people in the streets, they would be wondering whether he's talking about the African Union, because the African Union has failed lamentably, and everybody would agree with me in terms of harnessing our young men and women. And that is why, and allow me before I come to the youth, if the African Union was the body that he's talking about, would we have the following conflict that I'm going to talk about which the AU does nothing, including an ongoing conflict in the seat of the AU. Right now, as we speak, Ethiopia is on fire. In Tigray, in Amhara, and the AU's voice cannot be heard. I have to say this because if it goes unchallenged, you young people may think that the AU is a very useful organization. It is not. What it does is to pass protocol after protocol, treaty after treaty, ticking the boxes, and does nothing for our young people. And I think the record ought to be set straight. The AU is absent in the conflict between Kenya and Somalia. It is the Qataris who have been mediated. The AU is absent in the conflict between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The AU is absent in the conflict in South Sudan. The AU is absent in Nuba Mountains. It is absent in Western Nile. It is absent in Darfur. It is absent in Nigeria. It is absent in Northern Mozambique. It is absent in Somalia. It is absent in Ambazonia. It is absent in Central African Republic. It is absent in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That is the body that we have. And yet, I hear the good doctor, with due respect to him, saying that this is a beautiful body. Even what he says about Ebola, it was not because of the AU. The funding came from the European Union. So before we talk about organizations, and when we are talking to young people, I think it is incumbent upon us to represent Pan-African organizations in the right light. Right now, as I speak to you, only yesterday, 6,500 young men crossed the continent and went to Morocco, and they were turned back. The AU has said nothing. So I wanted to say that because I joined in when the good doctor was speaking, and I think it is important that we tell young people the right information. Now I can talk about what you asked me to talk about. I believe that Africa has a great opportunity. And once again, it has a great opportunity because we are talking about the youngest population on the face of this earth. We are talking about a population that is energized, but a population whose leaders have failed her, so that our young men and women do not see the opportunities that ought to be created by those who have the honor and privilege of serving as political leaders. And this explains, therefore, why you see young men and women running away. They are running away from Senegal, running away from Liberia, running away from Sierra Leone, running away from the Gambia, running away from Eritrea, all of them trying to get into Europe and America and to modern day slavery in the Arab world. And we may say many things and promise ourselves many things, but if our words are not wedded with our deeds, then Africa is not going to reap the youth dividend. As I speak to you now, we are reeling off the COVID-19, which is ongoing. And many young people have lost jobs. Look at the hospitality industry. And I've had the advantage of traveling across Africa. Even during the COVID period, I've traveled quite a bit in the continent of Africa. I walk into airports where all shops are closed. Young men and women have no jobs. I go into hotels where hotels are closed, and if they are not closed, there are very few patrons, with the consequence that young people are closed. In my own country, Kenya, last year we only received 500,000 tourists out of the usual figure of 2 million, and that can be replicated across the continent of Africa. And this in itself is indicative of the fact that if we don't change our tact, even the promises that are given to us under Africa Agenda 2063 will not be realized. Early on, in the month of January this year, the African Union once again initiated the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. A good thing on paper, nobody can quarrel. Many of the things that the African Union does on paper, you cannot quarrel with them. They are perfect. What is lacking is implementation. And you may say, some of us who are saying things, what are we doing to implement? We are not in government. It is governments that collect people's taxes. It is governments that are enjoined to implement this. Whatever the civil society does or the private sector does cannot have the same effect as a government that is utilizing our taxes. And one of the things that I would argue young people to do is to organize yourself. And I dare say that if you find the Pan-African institutions are not functioning, for example, they are going to have an election of the Pan-African Youth Parliament, I think, a useless body, completely useless, because it does not percolate into the inner sanctums of the people's population. If you walk the streets of Nairobi and ask 10 young men, do you know about Pan-African Youth Parliament? 9 will tell you they have never heard of it. If you walked in the streets of Bangui, the same. I can tell you, these are elitist organizations that are created by the Pan-African Union to recruit a few individuals who are active on social media, but the young men and women who are active in the villages and hamlets in Africa are unmoved and untouched. And I'm telling you this because I work with people in the grassroots, not on social media. I work with young men and women in slums. I work with young men and women in rural Africa. And I'm urging you, therefore, that if you, the young people, are going to change Africa, you must go beyond the frontiers that are defined by social media. There is an Africa out there that is suffering, an Africa out there that has no electricity, an Africa out there that has no internet connectivity, an Africa out there that does not know the computer, an African out there that wants to be fed, an Africa out there that is asking for practical things and that is unaware of Africa Agenda 2063, the text of it, or Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the text of it. I know of Africans who cannot cross the borders of their countries to go to the next until they have a visa. And yet we are told that there is free movement of goods and services. And young men, there are possibilities because we must eternally remain hopeful. If Africa is going to change, it is you young men and women who must change it. And you can only change it when your mind changes. It is the great Kwame Nkrumah who said immediately after Ghana regained independence that if Africa is to change, our young men and women must think differently. They must be young men and women who do not get into the comfort of the things that the politicians invite them to. They must remain uncomfortable and disruptive in an organized manner. It is only then that Africa is going to change. So today, my appeal to you, don't be lulled into a false sense of security on the assumption that things are going on well in Africa. Africa is punching below her economic weight. Africa is punching below her political weight. Africa is punching below her weight in all the critical things that define human indices. And it is you young men and women who must now talk with the firmness that will open the eyes of the bureaucrats, whether those bureaucrats be found in the African Union or those bureaucrats be found in your government. It is not your duty to massage the ego of anybody. It is your duty to tell them the truth, because the truth is what is going to ensure that Africa is catapulted to the orbit of true development. Otherwise, we'll be holding seminars, we'll be holding forums such as this, and you tick boxes and nothing changes. Nothing changes. Things will only change when you roll up your sleeves and don't allow yourselves to be manipulated. History is consistent in demonstrating that whenever young Africans have risen and played their part, Africa has changed. On Tuesday, we are going to celebrate we are going to celebrate African Day on the 25th, because that day in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the Organization of African Unity was created. But the question is, what are we going to celebrate? Because the things that Kwame Nkrumah and Nyerere and Dako and everybody else talked about on that day, not more than 30% of them have been achieved. We cannot do these things in the usual manner. Our health sector, we are still importing vaccines even as we talk. We cannot feed ourselves. We are not industrialized. We still produce what we do not consume and consume what we do not produce, as Ali Mazrui famously said. So as I conclude, because I would want to answer questions rather than to give you a straight talk, as I conclude, I'm telling you, ensure that wherever you are present in the villages and in the hamlets. There is a population of young Africans who are in the social media, but there is a larger population of young Africans who do not know what the social media is. They have no idea what Twitter is. They have no idea what Telegram is. They have no idea what Google Meets is. They have no idea what Zoom is. They have no idea what Blue Jeans is. They have no idea, and they are in the majority. If you don't address them, you are not addressing Africa. Thank you, and God bless you.